They laughed at him. They mocked his trembling hands, his worn-out shoes, his fragile walk. To them, he was nothing but an old man, weak, useless, invisible. But what if the man they humiliated carried a past darker than their arrogance could ever imagine? What if behind those tired eyes lived secrets capable of shattering illusions, exposing lies, and rewriting destinies? This is not a story about age. It is a story about cruelty, about the poison of prejudice, about the dangerous game of judging someone by appearances. Every insult, every smirk, every word thrown at him was a spark. And sparks, when ignored, can ignite fires no one can control. His name was Truman, a man of 68 years, living in New York City, 2023. To strangers, he looked fragile, forgotten, a shadow among the crowd. But Truman was not the man they thought he was. Behind the silence, behind the wrinkles, there was a storm waiting to be unleashed. How many times have we dismissed someone, believing they had no power left? How many times have we mistaken silence for weakness? The truth is, humiliation has consequences. And sometimes, the one you choose to humiliate is the very person who could destroy everything you thought was safe. If this opening already made your heart race, don't stop here. Hit the like button now, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so more people can discover stories like this. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from, your city, your country. Let's make this message echo across the world. The cafe in Brooklyn was crowded, filled with the restless energy of young voices and the clatter of cups against saucers. Truman sat alone at a corner table, his posture slightly bent, his hands trembling as he lifted a chipped mug of coffee. To most, he was invisible, a shadow among the noise. But to a group of arrogant young men, he was the perfect target. They noticed his worn-out shoes, the faded jacket that hung loosely on his shoulders, the slow, deliberate way he moved. One of them smirked, nudging the other, and soon laughter erupted. "Look at him," one sneered, loud enough for the entire cafe to hear. "Probably doesn't even know what day it is." Another added, "Old man, why don't you go back to the nursing home? You don't belong here." The words cut through the air like knives, sharp and merciless. Truman did not respond. His eyes remained fixed on the dark liquid in his cup, but inside, something stirred. The humiliation was not new. He had felt the sting of prejudice before, but this time, the cruelty carried a weight that pressed against his chest. The cafe grew quieter as the mockery continued, some patrons shifting uncomfortably, others pretending not to notice. One of the young men walked closer, towering over Truman, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're nothing, just a useless old man wasting space." The insult hung heavy, echoing in the silence that followed. Truman's hand tightened around the mug, his knuckles whitening. For a brief moment, his gaze lifted, and in his eyes flickered something unexpected, an intensity, a depth that unsettled even the boldest of his tormentors. But the laughter resumed, louder, harsher, feeding on the vulnerability they believed they had uncovered. Truman lowered his eyes again, his silence mistaken for weakness. Yet beneath that silence, a storm was forming. Every insult, every cruel word was fuel, igniting a fire that had been dormant for years. The humiliation was not the end, it was the beginning. And though no one in that cafe realized it, the man they ridiculed was far from powerless. He was waiting, calculating, preparing. The day would come when the world would learn who Truman truly was. The cafe's laughter eventually faded, replaced by the clinking of cups and the murmur of conversations that tried to erase the cruelty that had just unfolded. Truman remained seated, his back slightly hunched, his gaze locked on the untouched coffee before him. To the casual observer, he looked defeated, a man swallowed by humiliation. Yet those who dared to look closer would have seen something else, an unsettling calm, a silence that carried weight heavier than words. The young men, emboldened by their mockery, returned to their table, still chuckling, still feeding on the illusion of superiority. They believed the old man's silence was submission, proof that their insults had landed. But Truman's silence was not weakness. It was deliberate, calculated, a shield forged through decades of battles unseen by those who now ridiculed him. Every insult replayed in his mind, not as wounds, but as reminders. He had lived through storms far greater than the cruelty of strangers. He had faced betrayal, loss, and conspiracies that had once threatened to consume him. Compared to those shadows, the laughter of arrogant youth was nothing more than noise. Yet noise could become dangerous when left unchecked. A woman at a nearby table noticed the scene. Her eyes lingered on Truman, sensing something unusual in the way he carried himself. She saw the tremor in his hands, the weariness in his posture, but also the flicker of defiance in his gaze. It was as if the old man's silence spoke louder than the laughter that had tried to drown him. She leaned forward, whispering to her companion, "There's something about him, something they don't see." Truman finally lifted his cup, his movements slow but steady. He took a sip, placed it back on the table, and exhaled softly. The cafe's atmosphere shifted, subtle yet undeniable. Those who had mocked him felt a strange unease, though they could not explain why. His silence unsettled them, gnawed at their confidence, made their laughter feel hollow. The truth was simple. Truman's silence was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a man who had endured, who had survived, who had learned that words are fleeting but actions are eternal. And though no one in that cafe realized it yet, the silence they mistook for weakness was the very thing that would soon unravel their illusions. The storm was coming, and it began with silence. The night after the humiliation, Truman walked slowly through the streets of Manhattan, the city lights reflecting against the wet pavement. His figure blended into the crowd, just another old man moving through the chaos of New York. Yet inside his mind, the echoes of laughter from the cafe refused to fade. Each insult carried him back to places he had buried deep, places where power, betrayal, and shadows had once defined his existence. He reached his small apartment in Queens, a modest space filled with silence. On the walls hung no photographs, no decorations, only the emptiness of a man who had chosen anonymity. But in a drawer, locked and hidden, lay fragments of a life no one around him could imagine. Documents, letters, and photographs told the story of a man who had once stood at the center of influence, a man whose decisions had shaped destinies. Truman had not always been invisible. He had once been feared, respected, and envied. As he sat in the dim light, memories unfolded like ghosts. He remembered the boardrooms where his voice commanded attention, the alliances forged in secrecy, the betrayals that had cut deeper than any insult. He remembered the night when everything collapsed, when conspiracies turned against him, when friends became enemies, when the empire he had built crumbled. That was the night he chose to disappear, to become no one, to live as a shadow among strangers. The humiliation in the cafe was not simply cruelty. It was a reminder of the fragility of perception. Those young men believed they had mocked weakness, but in truth, they had awakened something far more dangerous. Truman's silence was not born of fear, it was born of knowledge. He understood the cost of power, the weight of secrets, the devastation of betrayal. And now, as the city roared outside his window, he felt the stirrings of a storm he had long suppressed. He opened the drawer, his hands steady despite the tremor that had betrayed him earlier. He pulled out a photograph, a younger version of himself, standing beside men who had once ruled industries, men whose names were still whispered in corridors of influence. He stared at the image, his eyes narrowing. The world believed he was gone, forgotten, erased. But humiliation had a way of resurrecting ghosts. Truman leaned back, closing his eyes. The past was not dead. It lived within him, waiting for the moment to rise again. And though the world saw only an old man, the truth was far more dangerous. The storm was coming, and it would not be gentle. The following morning, Truman returned to the streets of Brooklyn, his steps slow but deliberate, his presence almost invisible among the rush of commuters. The humiliation from the cafe lingered in the air like smoke, but Truman carried it with the same stoic silence that had defined him for years. Yet fate has a way of weaving threads when least expected. At the corner of Fulton Street, near a small bookstore, a woman approached him. She was the same one who had witnessed the scene at the cafe, the one whose eyes had caught the flicker of defiance in his gaze. Her name was Evelyn, a middle-aged teacher with a sharp mind and a compassionate heart. She stopped him, her voice hesitant but firm. "I saw what happened yesterday," she said. "You didn't deserve that." Truman looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he considered walking away, disappearing into the crowd as he always did. But something in her tone, an authenticity, a refusal to ignore cruelty, made him pause. He nodded slightly, acknowledging her words without speaking. Evelyn continued, her curiosity stronger than her caution. "There's something about you. You're not like they think you are." Her observation unsettled him. Few people ever looked beyond the surface, beyond the frailty of age. Yet Evelyn's eyes searched deeper, as if she sensed the storm beneath his silence. Truman finally spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying the weight of decades. "People see what they want to see." Evelyn frowned, unsatisfied with the simplicity of his answer. "No," she replied softly. "People see what you allow them to see." Her words struck him harder than the insults from the cafe. They carried truth, piercing through the armor he had built around himself. For the first time in years, Truman felt the fragile stirrings of connection. They walked together for a short distance, the city's noise surrounding them. Evelyn asked questions, but Truman offered little. Still, his silence spoke volumes. She sensed the depth of his past, the shadows that clung to him, the secrets he carried. And though he revealed nothing, she knew instinctively that the old man was far more than he appeared. As they parted ways, Evelyn turned back, her voice lingering in the air. "You shouldn't let them define you. One day, they'll regret it." Truman stood still, watching her disappear into the crowd. Her words echoed in his mind, intertwining with memories of betrayal, power, and vengeance. The encounter was brief, but it was enough. For the first time since the humiliation, Truman felt the possibility of change. Evelyn had seen him, not the frail old man, but the storm hidden beneath. And that recognition was dangerous because it meant the silence was beginning to crack. The city never slept, but beneath its restless pulse, shadows moved with purpose. Truman's humiliation had seemed like a trivial act to those young men, yet their cruelty was not born in isolation. Behind their arrogance lay threads of influence, whispers of manipulation, and a network of deceit that stretched far beyond the walls of a Brooklyn cafe. Days after the incident, Truman began to notice patterns. The same faces appeared in different places, lingering too long, watching too closely. Conversations hushed when he entered a room, and strangers exchanged glances that carried more than curiosity. It was as if the humiliation had been orchestrated, not spontaneous, a performance designed to provoke him. In the quiet of his apartment, Truman sifted through fragments of his past, searching for connections. He remembered the corporations he had once battled, the rivals who had plotted his downfall, the betrayals that had driven him into obscurity. Could it be that the young men were not simply cruel, but pawns in a larger game? The thought gnawed at him, awakening instincts he had buried years ago. Meanwhile, Evelyn reappeared. She had sensed the weight of Truman's silence, and her curiosity had only grown. She confronted him one evening outside the bookstore, her voice sharp with urgency. "They weren't just mocking you," she said. "I overheard them later. They mentioned names, places, things that don't make sense for ordinary kids." Truman's eyes narrowed, the storm within him stirring. Evelyn's words confirmed what he already suspected. The humiliation was a mask, hiding something far more sinister. The conspiracy began to take shape. The young men were connected to powerful figures, men who thrived on secrecy and control. Their laughter had been a weapon, their cruelty a test. Truman realized he was being watched, provoked, perhaps even baited. The humiliation was not random. It was intentional, a calculated move to draw him out of hiding. As the city lights flickered against the skyline, Truman understood the danger. Lies were spreading, conspiracies tightening, and his silence had become a threat to those who feared the truth he carried. The storm was no longer just within him. It was gathering around him, unseen but inevitable. And though the world believed he was powerless, Truman knew the truth. The days following Evelyn's warning were heavy with tension. Truman moved through the city with deliberate caution, his silence sharper than any spoken word. He had lived decades in the shadows, but now the shadows themselves seemed to close in around him. The humiliation at the cafe had been the spark, and the whispers of conspiracy had become the flame. Yet Truman knew that fire could only be fought with truth, or at least fragments of it. One evening, Evelyn confronted him again. They met in a quiet park in Queens, the winter air biting at their skin, the city's roar muffled by distance. She demanded answers, her voice trembling with both fear and determination. "You're not just an old man," she said. "I can feel it. Who are you really?" Truman studied her carefully. For years, he had hidden behind anonymity, allowing the world to believe he was nothing. But Evelyn's persistence had pierced the armor he had built. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn envelope. Inside was a photograph, himself, decades younger, standing beside men whose names still carried weight in the corridors of power. He handed it to her without a word. Evelyn's eyes widened as she recognized one of the faces. This is impossible. You were there? You were part of them." Her voice cracked with disbelief. Truman's silence was his answer. He had revealed only a fragment, a glimpse of the truth, but it was enough to shatter the illusion of weakness. The revelation unsettled Evelyn. She realized that the man mocked in a cafe was once a figure who had shaped destinies, a man whose decisions had rippled through industries and governments. Yet the photograph raised more questions than it answered. Why had he disappeared? Why was he living as a shadow? And why were strangers now conspiring against him? Truman's eyes met hers, steady and unyielding. "The past never dies," he said quietly. "It waits." His words carried the weight of prophecy, a warning that the storm was not only coming, it had already begun. Evelyn felt a chill, not from the winter air, but from the realization that she was now entangled in something far larger than herself. The partial revelation was enough to change everything. Truman had cracked the silence, exposing a glimpse of the man he truly was. And though Evelyn now carried the burden of knowledge, she also carried the danger that came with it. The conspiracies were tightening, the lies spreading, and the storm gathering. For Truman, the time of hiding was ending. The world would soon learn that the man they humiliated was far more than they could ever imagine. The city pulsed with indifference, but Truman's silence had transformed into something sharper, something dangerous. The humiliation at the cafe had been the catalyst, the conspiracies the fuel, and Evelyn's discovery the spark that ignited the storm within him. For years, he had lived as a shadow, content to let the world forget his name. But now, the arrogance of youth and the whispers of hidden enemies had forced him to awaken. Truman began to move differently through New York. His steps, once slow and weary, carried purpose. He observed, listened, and calculated. The young men who had mocked him were not random aggressors. They were connected, threads woven into a larger tapestry of deceit. He followed them discreetly, blending into the crowd, his presence unnoticed. He watched their meetings in dimly lit bars, overheard fragments of conversations about money, influence, and names that carried weight in the city's underworld. Each observation sharpened his resolve. Vengeance was no longer an abstract thought. It was a plan forming in the shadows. Truman understood the language of power, the mechanics of manipulation, the fragility of arrogance. He had once commanded empires, and though time had aged his body, his mind remained a weapon. The humiliation had awakened instincts long dormant, instincts that thrived on strategy and patience. Evelyn sensed the change. When she met him again, she noticed the intensity in his eyes, the way his silence carried menace rather than resignation. "You're planning something," she whispered, half fearful, half fascinated. Truman did not answer, but his gaze told her everything. He was no longer content to endure. He was preparing to strike. The escalation began subtly. Truman leaked fragments of information, whispers that unsettled his enemies. He manipulated small events, turning allies against each other, sowing seeds of doubt. The young men who had once laughed at him began to feel the weight of paranoia, their confidence eroding as unseen forces pressed against them. They did not know the source, but Truman knew. Every move was deliberate, every silence calculated. The city remained oblivious, but beneath its surface, a storm gathered momentum. Truman's vengeance was not loud or impulsive. It was precise, methodical, inevitable. The humiliation had been their mistake. The escalation was his response. And though they still believed him powerless, the truth was clear. Truman was far from defeated. He was rising, and his vengeance would be merciless. The city's rhythm carried on as if nothing had changed, but for Truman, every passing day revealed cracks in the facade of those around him. Betrayal had always been a familiar companion in his past, yet now it returned with a sharper edge, cutting through the fragile connections he had begun to rebuild. The humiliation at the cafe had awakened the storm, but betrayal was the blade that threatened to carve deeper wounds. Evelyn, who had stood by him with curiosity and compassion, began to notice strange movements in her own life. Colleagues whispered behind her back, neighbors avoided her gaze, and anonymous messages appeared in her inbox warning her to stay away from the old man. At first, she dismissed them as paranoia, but the persistence of these warnings unsettled her. Someone wanted her silenced. Someone feared the truth she had glimpsed in Truman's eyes. Meanwhile, Truman observed the young men who had mocked him. Their arrogance was beginning to fracture. One of them, pressured by unseen forces, betrayed the group, leaking information to outsiders in exchange for protection. Truman watched as alliances shifted, as trust dissolved in broad daylight. Betrayal was no longer hidden in shadows. It was unfolding openly, tearing apart the very network that had conspired against him. Yet betrayal did not stop with them. Evelyn discovered that a close friend, someone she had confided in about Truman, had secretly passed her words to others. The betrayal stung, not because of the loss of trust, but because it confirmed the reach of the conspiracy. Truman's silence had become dangerous, and anyone near him was now a target. Truman understood the pattern. Betrayal was not random. It was orchestrated, designed to isolate him, to strip away any support he might find. But he had lived through betrayals far greater than these. He knew that betrayal was both a weapon and a weakness. Those who betrayed revealed their fear, their desperation, their inability to withstand pressure. And Truman thrived on exploiting weakness. As the sun set over Manhattan, casting long shadows across the streets, Truman stood at the edge of the chaos, watching the betrayals unfold. He did not flinch, did not waver. Every betrayal was a piece of the puzzle, every broken alliance a step closer to the truth. The storm was gathering, and betrayal was merely the beginning of its fury. The storm inside Truman had grown louder, pressing against the silence he had carried for years. Vengeance had begun to take shape. Betrayal had revealed cracks in the conspiracy, and Evelyn's presence had forced him to confront truths he had long buried. Yet as the path of retaliation unfolded before him, a heavier burden emerged, the weight of morality. Truman had lived through decades of power, deception, and downfall. He knew the mechanics of destruction, the precision of manipulation, the inevitability of vengeance. But now, as he stood on the edge of reclaiming control, he faced a question that gnawed at him. Was vengeance justice, or was it simply another form of cruelty? The humiliation at the cafe had awakened his fury, but had also forced him to confront the fragility of human dignity. Late at night, in his dim apartment, Truman sat alone with the fragments of his past spread across the table. Photographs, documents, letters, all reminders of the man he once was. He stared at them, his mind torn between two paths. One path led to vengeance, a storm that would consume those who had mocked and conspired against him. The other path led to restraint, a choice to rise above cruelty and prove that silence could be stronger than violence. Evelyn sensed his conflict. When she visited him, she found him restless, his eyes shadowed by doubt. "You want to strike back," she said softly, "but you're not sure if it will make you any different from them." Truman did not answer, but his silence confirmed her words. She pressed further, her voice trembling with urgency. "You've carried secrets, power, and pain. But maybe the greatest strength is not in vengeance. It's in choosing something greater." Her words unsettled him. For years, Truman had believed that silence was survival, that vengeance was inevitable. Yet Evelyn's compassion forced him to consider the possibility of redemption. Could he teach through restraint? Could he transform humiliation into a lesson rather than a weapon? The weight of morality pressed harder, heavier than betrayal, heavier than conspiracy. Still, the storm within him refused to fade. He knew that cruelty unchecked would only grow, that arrogance unpunished would only spread. Justice demanded action, but morality demanded reflection. Truman stood at the crossroads, torn between the man he had been and the man he could become. The city roared outside, indifferent to his struggle. But within Truman, the battle was fierce. The weight of morality was crushing, yet it was also the very thing that defined him. And though the world saw only an old man, Truman knew the truth. The choice he made would determine not only his fate, but the lesson the world would carry from his silence. The city's heartbeat echoed through the streets, but beneath its rhythm lay a darker pulse, one that Truman had begun to sense with growing clarity. The humiliation at the cafe had been the surface wound, but the infection ran deeper. What had seemed like the arrogance of a few young men was now revealed as part of a larger design, a conspiracy that stretched far beyond Brooklyn's walls. Truman's observations grew sharper. He noticed the same faces appearing in different boroughs, men in suits lingering near government buildings, whispers exchanged in alleyways where power was traded like currency. The young men who mocked him were not acting alone. They were connected to figures who thrived in secrecy, men whose influence seeped into politics, corporations, and the underworld. Their cruelty had been a test, a provocation, orchestrated by those who feared the truth Truman carried. Evelyn, caught in the web, discovered fragments of evidence. A document left carelessly in a cafe, a phone call overheard in the subway, a name repeated too often to be coincidence. She brought these pieces to Truman, her voice trembling with urgency. "This isn't just about humiliation," she said. "They're watching you. They know who you are." Truman's silence was heavy, his eyes narrowing as he studied the evidence. He recognized the names, the symbols, the patterns. These were not strangers. They were remnants of the world he had once inhabited, men who had betrayed him decades ago, men who had thrived while he disappeared into obscurity. The conspiracy was not new. It was old, festering, waiting for the moment to strike again. The realization cut deep. Truman understood that his humiliation had been staged to draw him out, to expose him, to remind him that the past was never truly buried. The young men were pawns, their arrogance manipulated by forces they could not comprehend. Behind them stood architects of deceit, men who feared the storm Truman carried within him. As the city lights flickered against the skyline, Truman felt the weight of inevitability. The conspiracy was greater than he had imagined, its reach extending into every corner of power. Yet he did not falter. He had lived through betrayal, humiliation, and silence. He knew the language of conspiracies, the fragility of arrogance, the inevitability of downfall. The storm was no longer just within him. It was everywhere, gathering momentum, pressing against the walls of secrecy. And though the world still saw only an old man, Truman knew the truth. The conspiracy had awakened the wrong enemy. The city's pulse grew heavier as Truman prepared for the inevitable confrontation. The humiliation at the cafe had been the spark, the betrayals the fuel, and the conspiracy the storm. Now, the moment had arrived when silence could no longer shield him. The truth, long buried beneath decades of shadows, was ready to erupt. It began in a crowded hall in Manhattan, where the young men who had mocked him gathered with their benefactors, figures of influence cloaked in arrogance and secrecy. They believed Truman was powerless, a relic of the past, a man too fragile to resist. Yet Truman entered the room with a calm that unsettled even the boldest among them. His presence was quiet, but his eyes carried the weight of storms. The laughter that had once ridiculed him faltered as he stepped forward. Evelyn was there, standing at the edge, her gaze locked on him, knowing that this was the moment when the world would see the man behind the silence. Truman reached into his coat and pulled out documents, photographs, fragments of evidence that exposed the conspiracy for what it truly was. Names, dates, transactions, all revealed in stark detail. The room fell silent. The young men who had mocked him stared in disbelief, their arrogance collapsing under the weight of revelation. Their benefactors shifted uneasily, their secrets unraveling in front of witnesses. Truman's voice, steady and deliberate, cut through the silence. You thought humiliation would break me. You thought betrayal would silence me. But the truth cannot be buried. Not by arrogance. Not by cruelty. Not by lies. The words struck like thunder, reverberating through the hall. The storm he had carried within him was unleashed, not with violence, but with truth. The humiliation had been transformed into power, the silence into weaponry, the past into revelation. The conspiracy, once hidden in shadows, now stood exposed in the light. Evelyn watched as the room fractured. Some tried to deny, others tried to flee, but none could escape the truth Truman had revealed. The old man they had mocked was not powerless. He was the storm, the reckoning, the embodiment of resilience. His silence had spoken louder than their laughter, his truth louder than their lies. The climax was not in vengeance, but in revelation. Truman had shown the world who he truly was, and in doing so, he had shattered the illusions that had sought to destroy him. The humiliation was no longer a wound. It was the foundation of his triumph. The hall in Manhattan trembled under the weight of Truman's disclosure. Documents scattered across the table, photographs exposed, names spoken aloud with precision. Every fragment of truth cut through the arrogance that had once mocked him. The revelation was not a whisper, but a thunderclap, echoing beyond the walls, spilling into the streets, into the city's veins. The young men who had humiliated him stood frozen, their laughter extinguished, their bravado shattered. They had believed they were untouchable, protected by the shadows of powerful benefactors. Yet now, stripped bare by Truman's evidence, they were nothing more than pawns revealed in daylight. Their faces drained of color, their voices silenced by the storm they had awakened. The benefactors themselves, men cloaked in influence and secrecy, shifted uneasily. Some attempted denial, others sought escape, but the truth was relentless. Truman had not simply exposed their conspiracy, he had dismantled their illusion of control. Every name spoken, every transaction revealed, was a blade cutting through the fabric of their power. The humiliation they had orchestrated had become their downfall. Evelyn watched from the edge, her heart pounding. She had seen Truman's silence, his pain, his hesitation, but now she witnessed his transformation. The frail old man mocked in a cafe had become a storm that consumed arrogance and deceit. His revelation was not just personal, it was universal, a lesson carved into the conscience of everyone present. Outside the hall, whispers spread quickly. The city began to murmur of the old man who had exposed giants, of the storm that had risen from silence. Reporters gathered, cameras flashed, and the story unfolded across headlines. Truman's name, once forgotten, now carried weight again, not as a relic of the past, but as a symbol of resilience, of truth, of defiance against cruelty. The impact was profound. Those who had laughed now lived in fear. Those who had betrayed now faced consequences. And those who had dismissed him as powerless now saw the truth. Truman was not weak, not invisible, not forgotten. He was the embodiment of endurance, the living proof that silence can be more dangerous than noise. The revelation had changed everything. It had shattered illusions, dismantled conspiracies, and forced the city to confront its own prejudice. The humiliation had been transformed into triumph, the silence into weaponry, the old man into legend. And though the storm had been unleashed, Truman remained calm, his eyes steady, his voice quiet. He had carried the truth for decades, and now the world carried it with him. The impact of revelation was not just in the downfall of his enemies. It was in the awakening of those who had once believed silence meant weakness. The city awoke to a storm not of rain, but of revelation. Truman's truth had spread beyond the hall, beyond the whispers, beyond the conspiracies. Headlines carried his name, voices debated his past, and the arrogance that once mocked him dissolved into fear. Yet for Truman, the storm was not about fame or vengeance. It was about the lesson carved into the hearts of those who had witnessed cruelty and silence collide. In the days that followed, the young men who had humiliated him vanished from the spotlight, their arrogance consumed by shame. Their benefactors, once untouchable, faced investigations, their secrets dragged into daylight. Betrayals were punished, conspiracies dismantled, and lies exposed. The city, once indifferent to the frail old man in a cafe, now carried his story as a warning. Never mistake silence for weakness. Never mistake age for irrelevance. Evelyn remained by his side, her presence a reminder that compassion could pierce even the darkest storms. She saw the weight Truman carried, the burden of truth, the scars of betrayal. Yet she also saw the resilience that defined him, the strength that had transformed humiliation into triumph. "You've changed everything," she whispered one evening as they walked through Central Park. Truman's gaze lingered on the skyline, his voice quiet but firm. "No." I reminded them of what they chose to forget. The lesson was clear. Humiliation had consequences. Prejudice had limits. Cruelty had a cost. Truman's silence had been his shield, his weapon, his storm. And when the world finally saw him, it was not as a frail old man, but as a force that demanded respect. The city moved forward, but the memory remained. People spoke of the old man who had been mocked, who had carried secrets, who had exposed giants. His story became more than a scandal. It became a mirror, reflecting the arrogance of those who judge by appearances and the resilience of those who endure. Truman returned to his quiet apartment, the storm within him finally calm. He had carried the truth for decades, and now the world carried it with him. The humiliation had been transformed into a lesson, the silence into a legacy. And though the city lights flickered as they always had, the world was different, because one man, mocked and dismissed, had shown that dignity cannot be destroyed, that silence can speak louder than cruelty, and that truth, once revealed, can change everything. The storm was over. The lesson remained.